In the last video, I briefly mentioned that a constructor is defined within the class and it's used to actually create the object instances. So we call the TextView constructor to create this instance, and we call it again to create another instance, and so on. Let's look at the code for how to actually call a constructor. Do you remember how we created a new integer variable named quantity, and we set it to have an initial value of 2? Creating a new object and storing it inside a variable is going to follow a similar format. It'll look something like this. Instead of the int data type, though, we have an object data type. The object data type is whatever we call the class name. In this case, it's TextView. It can be anything as long as it follows the conventions for variable names. So we just call it price TextView. Then we set it equal to new object, but we can break down this right-hand side further. The right-hand side follows the format of new followed by the object data type, which is TextView in this case. This is calling the constructor defined in the TextView class. So we have parentheses with the input arguments to the constructor. So if the constructor requires a context object, then we need to pass a context here. Remember that the context object helps you access application resources and other things about the application environment. So altogether, this is creating a new TextView object by calling the constructor, and then it's storing this new object inside a variable called price TextView. And this variable can only hold a single TextView object as defined by its data type. Here's another example of creating an ImageView object and storing it inside a variable. The data type is ImageView, the variable name is CoffeeImageView, and then we have the assignment operator followed by new ImageView. This is spelled the same exact way as the object data type here. Since we're calling the constructor and we have to pass in any inputs, we have parentheses and then we put the inputs in there. Here's a third example that creates a button object and stores it in this variable. The data type is button, the variable name is submit order button, and then we say new button to call the constructor. You can even define your own object data types. Say, for example, I created a class definition for cat view. Then I could use this line to create a new cat view. In this case, the constructor requires an input string for the name of the cat, so that's why I put tiger in parentheses and pass that into the cat view constructor. To determine what to pass as input to these constructors, you have to look at either the class javadoc file or the class source file. All these cases use the word new to create a new object. If we go back to the Java keyword list, then indeed we do find that the word new is in that list. Sometimes when you're looking at the documentation, it may advise you to use a factory method to create an object. That is, instead of a constructor. Here's an example. To create a new media player, the documentation advises you to use the method mediaplayer.create. And this returns a media player object that can be stored inside this variable. It follows the format of object data type, so media player with a capital M, dot, and then the factory method name, which is create in this case, and then you pass in the input arguments to initialize that media player. Here's another example of how to create a toast. A toast is a message that pops up temporarily in your app and then disappears. So the code starts with toast with a capital T, because this is the object data type, and then we have a dot, and then make text, which is the factory method name. And then we pass the input arguments to create this toast. To know what the factory method name is and what the input arguments are, you'd have to check the documentation for the toast class. In general, in order to know whether you should create an object using a constructor or with a factory method, you can just Google search for how to create that object. Using a constructor is the most common way to create a new object. It's less common that you would need to use a factory method, but to know for sure which one you should use, you can just Google search for how to create that object. Here's a chance to practice with creating objects. In each of these lines of code, there's an error. Figure out what the error is and then write the correct line of code in these boxes below.